Hey, here I am talking about Module 1. Module 1 of this program is called the Neuroscience of Mindfulness and Anxiety. So the really cool thing about mindfulness is that as a vehicle to alleviate anxiety, stress, or any other amazing benefit that it has, it's really backed. The benefits are super backed by science. And this is when I kind of geek out a little bit because I love the neuroscience aspect of all of this, to really see how these practices are working within our brain to change our brain and rewire our brain so that we are better able to deal with anxiety. We become more resilient. We have less anxiety, less stress, and overall, it actually helps us to become happier, healthier human beings. And so basically, what happens with anxiety is that there are 3 different levels of our brain. So there's the reptilian brain, which is sort of at the base of our neck. It's like where our brain stem is at the back there. And that is responsible for things that like keep us alive. So the breathing, digestion, all of these things that are basically working autonomously while we are doing everything else in our life, that's what's responsible there. Then we have something called the limbic system. And this is the part of our brain that helps to regulate emotions. And this is actually where a lot of our sensory input is sent first, because this is the space where if we are in danger, the amygdala actually gets fired up, and the amygdala sends out adrenaline and cortisol. And this is where the fight, flight, or freeze response mainly resides. Okay, and so for those of you who haven't heard of the fight, flight, or freeze response, it is basically the idea that when we are facing danger or when we are threatened by something that is threatening our life, that part of the brain is activated, and we go into this fight, flight, or freeze. So let's say there is, this is the classic example, there's a saber-toothed tiger and he's chasing us. So we see that saber-toothed tiger and we go, oh my gosh. And this part of our brain fires up. It sends adrenaline, it sends cortisol. And why does it do this? Because in case we need to run away from this thing, or if we need to stay and fight this thing, or potentially we need to freeze, whatever it is that we need to do, it is giving us that energy, that power, that quick thinking ability by flooding our brain with that stuff, okay? So that is the second part of our brain. Then there's a third part of our brain, which is called the prefrontal, or sorry, not the prefrontal, that's part of this, the neocortex. And that is sort of the entire part that sits on top of our brain that we see with all those little squiggly lines in the brain. And so in the front part here behind our brain is called the prefrontal cortex. And the prefrontal cortex is responsible for a lot of our logic, decision-making, problem solving, okay? And the entire cortex, that upper part, is really what differentiates humans from the rest of the animal kingdom. This is what gives us the sense of self, of our sense of who we are, okay? And also, again, like I said, especially in the front part of the brain, it is responsible for a lot of our logical decision-making, etc. So oftentimes when we are experiencing anxiety, sometimes we'll say, you know, I understand that what I'm thinking is not actually logical, but yet I 100% believe it anyways. And that's actually because when we are having anxiety, we're basically putting our body into this fight, flight, or freeze. We feel threatened. Whatever it is, whether it's reasonable or not reasonable, we feel threatened. And so we live in a world today where we are not actually being chased by saber-toothed tigers. In fact, we live relatively safe lives. However, our brain's job is to try to keep us alive. And so it is constantly searching for things that could perhaps endanger us. And so what happens is that in some people with anxiety, this becomes dysregulated and we become hyper aware of all of these different threats and things. And for some of us, our thought process continues to the point where we just continuously worry and stress and we feel this anxiety. And so what happens is that when the amygdala is so fired up that our brain has to start to take away some of its other processes because that part of the brain is using so much of our power. The brain itself takes about 20% of our brain power each and every day. And so out of that 20%, if we are spending so much of it firing up this amygdala and putting ourselves in fight, flight, or freeze, other parts of our brain can't function so well. And so what happens is the prefrontal cortex actually begins to go offline, which is why, despite knowing that these anxieties maybe aren't happening right now, we believe them 100% in that moment, because that logical problem-solving part of our brain is going offline. It's not using as much energy, and this amygdala is using most of it. Okay. And so this is probably the fastest I have ever tried to explain this. But I was really trying to give a fairly quick synopsis of this neuroscience. And the reason that it's so important is because what happens with anxiety is that our amygdala is constantly fired up, right? This is what's sending all of these hormones and the adrenaline, the cortisol into our body. And so when it's fired up, we become more susceptible to threats and things. So we have this vicious circle because our logical part of the brain goes offline, the amygdala fires up, and we just get caught in this constant state of anxiety, of stress, of fear. And so how do we stop the amygdala from firing up so much? And the answer to that is actually mindfulness and meditation. And so there have actually, in about the last decade, been a lot of studies on the brain effects, or on the effects of mindfulness meditation on the brain. And what it has shown is that by practicing mindfulness meditation and various exercises that are related, is that the amygdala, the fight, flight, or freeze, starts to shrink, and the prefrontal cortex actually grows. And so what does that mean? It means that when that amygdala starts to fire up, the prefrontal cortex can come online faster, and it doesn't get kicked offline. You can think of this like dial-up internet or something, right? Now we're using high-speed internet, and that prefrontal cortex can come back online and say, okay, you know what? This is illogical. Let's think about this in a more logical way. Okay, so this is why mindfulness and mindfulness meditation are such amazing tools to use to alleviate anxiety. But of course, it's not just about sitting in meditative poses all day, or in meditative, sitting in meditation all day. It's also about learning different tools and techniques and ways of thinking that can help to increase the speed at which this mindfulness and meditation can begin to really help us to alleviate our anxiety symptoms. And so this is really the basis of what the rest of this entire program is about. It's about learning different ways to utilize mindfulness and meditation and the awareness that this brings with it, so that we can begin to become aware of our anxiety, why it happens, how it happens, and how we can learn to sit with that anxiety and take back the control. Okay, so this is a very, very, very brief summary of the neuroscience of mindfulness and meditation and how it will help us to alleviate our anxiety. If you're interested in learning more, I did do a webinar on it previously, so I will put that link below this video, and you can sign up to have that emailed to you if you are interested in learning more. Because as we go through, it may be of interest for you to have a better understanding. But that is basically the synopsis, that we can, through mindfulness meditation and something called neuroplasticity, we can actually rewire our brain so that these anxious thoughts do not happen nearly so often, and that we can start logically thinking about what these anxious thoughts are, how to overcome them, and how to move forward. So this entire subject is so exciting to me. I've got about a 1-hour video on it. If you want to learn more about this specifically, if you haven't seen it already, then click the link below, sign up, and I will email you a link so that you can actually watch that whole video. Otherwise, that was the quickest I think I've ever discussed the neuroscience of mindfulness as it relates to anxiety. And I'm excited to see you in the next video in module 2 called We Are Not Our Thoughts. See you there.